Jay Silverheels, born Harold J. Smith in 1912, wasn't always the icon the world would later recognize as Tonto. Beneath the painted face and heroic mask lay a man shaped by hardship, determination, and a relentless fight against the odds. His story begins in the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada, where life was anything but easy. Growing up as a Mohawk, Jay faced poverty, systemic racism, and the weight of being part of a marginalized community in early 20th century Canada. Every step forward demanded grit and resilience, traits that would define both his personal and professional life. Before the fame, Jay was a gifted athlete. He excelled in lacrosse, a sport deeply rooted in his Indigenous culture, eventually becoming one of Canada's top players. Yet, sports alone couldn't shield him from the prejudice that followed him everywhere. Even in the arenas, he was often reduced to the native kid who could run fast, a label that never captured his true potential. These early battles, invisible to the audiences who would later know him as Tonto, forged a man ready to defy Hollywood's narrow expectations. Hollywood, however, was a different battlefield. The industry was notorious for its stereotypes, and Indigenous actors were rarely given roles with depth or dignity. Jay knew that landing a part wouldn't just be about talent. It would be about navigating a system designed to pigeonhole him. Every audition, every meeting, felt like a test of endurance. And when he finally got the chance to portray Tonto in 1950's The Lone Ranger, he stepped into a role that would bring him global recognition but also trap him within a limited image that never reflected his full humanity. Behind the cameras, few knew the struggles Jay carried silently. The pressures of fame, combined with the constant battle against discrimination, created a tension that simmered just below the surface. He had to balance public perception with personal integrity, all while staying true to his Mohawk heritage. Even as fans cheered, Jay confronted moments of isolation, reminders that the man they celebrated was more than just a sidekick in a cowboy story. Yet, Jay's early life also gave him a quiet strength. The lessons learned on the reserve, the importance of family, community, and perseverance, shaped how he approached every challenge. Those formative years instilled a resilience that allowed him to navigate Hollywood's stormy waters and eventually become an advocate for Indigenous representation in entertainment. His journey wasn't just about survival. It was about laying a foundation for those who would follow, even if the world only saw him as Tonto. When Jay Silverheels first donned the role of Tonto, he stepped into a character that would become instantly recognizable around the world, but not without its shadows. Tonto, the stoic Native American sidekick to the Lone Ranger, was a role wrapped in cliches, stereotypes, and Hollywood's limited imagination of Indigenous people. For Jay, the challenge wasn't just acting. It was navigating a fine line between visibility and typecasting, between representation and caricature. Every scene, every line, carried weight beyond entertainment. Audiences adored Tonto, but behind the mask, Jay often wrestled with the constraints of the character. He knew that the way Hollywood portrayed Native Americans was simplistic at best, damaging at worst. Yet, he also understood the opportunity he had. Tonto gave him a platform, a rare space in mainstream media to bring authenticity, however subtle, to a character seen by millions. He infused Tonto with small, deliberate gestures of dignity, moments that hinted at humanity rather than stereotype. But those nuances were easily lost amidst the cowboy adventures and dramatic cliffhangers of the show. The pressures of playing Tonto weren't confined to the screen. Off-camera, Jay constantly faced questions and comments that reduced him to the role. Strangers would approach him as though Tonto and Jay were the same person, expecting the same silence, the same loyalty, the same stoicism. He had to reconcile his public persona with his private identity, a struggle that weighed heavily over the years. How do you break free from a character that defines you in the eyes of millions when your true self feels so different? Jay also experienced the behind-the-scenes realities of typecasting firsthand. Casting directors rarely considered him for leading roles, and scripts for Indigenous characters were often poorly written, one-dimensional, or outright insulting. He tried to educate, to advocate, to suggest authenticity, but Hollywood was slow to listen. Even so, he persisted, subtly pushing boundaries wherever he could. His determination to portray Tonto with respect became a quiet act of rebellion against the industry's stereotypes. And yet, There was a strange duality. While Tonto limited him in some ways, it also provided financial stability and fame, and it allowed him to travel and meet people he never would have otherwise. Jay had to embrace the paradox. The very role that confined him also elevated him. It was a bittersweet reality, and it defined much of his professional life. A balancing act between breaking stereotypes and surviving in a system designed to contain him. Through it all, Jay Silverheels showed that even in roles constrained by prejudice, one could leave an imprint of authenticity, courage, and humanity. His Tonto wasn't perfect, but it was alive, and for many viewers, it became a first glimpse of indigenous presence in American pop culture, however flawed. Behind the polished episodes of The Lone Ranger, Hollywood's glitz masked a world far messier than viewers could imagine. Jay Silverheels, despite his fame as Tonto, witnessed and endured moments on set that few outsiders knew. Beneath the cowboy hats, staged gunfights, and heroic music, there was tension, politics, and bias. An invisible battle that tested his patience, resilience, and dignity. One of the harshest realities was the way indigenous actors were treated. While Jay brought skill, professionalism, and authenticity to every scene, many producers and directors viewed him as merely a prop, a sidekick to the white hero, existing to enhance someone else's story. Lines were often written without care, and scripts sometimes included outdated or offensive portrayals of native culture. Jay had to navigate these daily indignities, carefully choosing when to push back and when to accept the compromises necessary to keep his career afloat. But the challenges weren't only systemic, they were personal. Rivalries and egos ran rampant behind the cameras. Jay sometimes found himself at odds with cast members who underestimated him, seeing Tonto's quiet stoicism as weakness rather than strength. There were whispered rumors, small betrayals, and moments of exclusion that chipped away at his confidence. Even as the cameras rolled and fans adored the dynamic duo on screen, Jay often felt isolated, a man caught between admiration and invisibility. There were also darker stories that rarely made headlines. Accounts from crew members hinted at conflicts that escalated behind closed doors, disputes over creative control, and incidents where Jay had to assert himself simply to maintain basic respect. Though he rarely spoke publicly about these experiences, those closest to him described a man who carried the weight of these challenges with quiet dignity, refusing to let anger define his legacy. Despite the hardships, Jay's professionalism never wavered. He remained committed to his craft, elevating Tonto from a one-dimensional sidekick to a character remembered for generations. Yet, the truth of Hollywood's inner workings during that era serves as a stark reminder. Fame often comes at a cost. For Jay Silverheels, every smile on screen concealed a story of struggle, perseverance, and subtle rebellion against an industry that too often undervalued him. His experience on set was a masterclass in resilience. Jay learned to navigate an environment that was both his stage and his cage. And while audiences celebrated the heroic deeds of the Lone Ranger and his faithful companion, only Jay knew the full measure of what it took to survive and thrive, behind the scenes, in a world that never truly welcomed him as an equal. While the world saw Tonto as brave, loyal, and unwavering, Jay Silverheels faced battles off-camera that no script could capture. Fame, as thrilling as it was, came with a heavy price. Behind the spotlight, he wrestled with personal struggles, some rooted in his upbringing, others born from the relentless pressures of Hollywood life. The man who thrilled millions carried burdens quietly, often alone. One of Jay's greatest challenges was the constant tension between his public image and private identity. Fans adored Tonto, expecting stoicism, loyalty, and a sort of silent heroism. But Jay was more than a sidekick. He had opinions, emotions, and dreams that often clashed with the restrictive molds of his career. Maintaining this delicate balance created immense stress, leading to periods of isolation and introspection. Even those closest to him noticed a man who sometimes seemed distant, haunted by the gap between who he was and who the world wanted him to be. There were also battles with the darker side of Hollywood's social scene. Pressure to fit into the glamorous lifestyle, deal with behind-the-scenes politics, and navigate relationships with influential figures often tested his moral compass. Stories emerged of conflicts over contracts, recognition, and pay disparity. Issues Jay confronted quietly but persistently. Each decision became a test of integrity, and every compromise left its mark. He knew that challenging the system could jeopardize his career, yet remaining silent felt equally impossible. Family and cultural pressures added another layer of complexity. Jay remained deeply connected to his Mohawk roots, often grappling with how to honor his heritage in a world that frequently misrepresented it. He worked tirelessly to support indigenous causes, mentoring young actors and advocating for better representation in media. But these efforts were often invisible to the public, overshadowed by the shadow of Tonto. The struggle to reconcile fame with authenticity shaped much of his adult life, leaving him to fight battles that were as much about identity as they were about career. And yet, through it all, Jay's resilience never faltered. Despite emotional strain, public scrutiny, and personal setbacks, he remained steadfast, turning hardship into quiet strength. Every challenge off camera, every injustice, misunderstanding, or betrayal added layers to the man behind the mask. Jay Silverheel's life was a testament to endurance, a story of perseverance that mirrored the struggles of countless indigenous actors before and after him. Even today, when people recall Tonto, few realize the depth of Jay's journey. Behind the iconic role was a man navigating a world that often didn't see him, fighting battles both public and private, and leaving a legacy that extends far beyond the television screen. His story is a reminder that true courage isn't only heroic deeds. It's surviving, adapting, and thriving in the face of relentless adversity. When the final credits of The Lone Ranger rolled and the cameras stopped filming, Jay Silverheels faced the ultimate question. How would history remember him? For decades, the world knew him as Tonto, the loyal sidekick in the iconic Western series. But behind that label was a man whose impact stretched far beyond the television screen. His legacy is one of complexity, resilience, and quiet revolution in an industry that rarely recognized indigenous talent. Jay's contribution to Hollywood was subtle but profound. By embodying Tonto with dignity, intelligence, and authenticity, he challenged audiences to see Native Americans not as caricatures but as real, multidimensional people. Even within the confines of a stereotypical role, he added layers that spoke to cultural pride and personal integrity. In a way, he rewrote the narrative, showing that representation mattered, even if Hollywood was slow to catch up. Outside of his on-screen persona, Jay became a mentor and advocate. He tirelessly worked to open doors for other indigenous actors, emphasizing the importance of education, cultural preservation, and professional excellence. These efforts were not always visible to the public, overshadowed by the popularity of Tonto, yet they planted seeds for future generations. Many modern actors and filmmakers cite Jay as an inspiration, someone who demonstrated that perseverance and integrity could coexist with fame. Yet, the truth of Jay Silverheel's life also includes the hardships he endured. Typecasting, limited opportunities, and systemic bias marked much of his career, and his personal struggles often remained hidden. Only by looking closely at his life beyond the mask can we understand the full scope of his story. The sacrifices, the resilience, and the quiet courage required to navigate an industry that too often failed to see him as more than a stereotype. Today, historians and fans alike are re-examining his legacy. Documentaries, biographies, and interviews with colleagues paint a richer picture of a man who was much more than a character. He was a trailblazer who broke barriers for indigenous representation, a mentor who nurtured new talent, and a symbol of perseverance in the face of systemic obstacles. His story reminds us that fame is complicated and that the truth behind the roles we see on screen often hides a far more compelling human story. Jay Silverheels passed away in 1980, but his influence endures. As we reflect on his life, we are reminded that true legacy isn't just about the roles one plays. It's about the battles fought, the lives touched, and the courage to remain authentic in a world that insists on simplification. Tonto may have been his mask, but Jay Silverheel's truth is far richer, far more human, and finally, more fully recognized. Jay Silverheel's life was far more than the iconic role of Tonto. Behind the mask, he was a man of resilience, courage, and quiet rebellion, a trailblazer navigating a Hollywood that too often reduced him to a stereotype. He faced personal struggles, systemic bias, and professional limitations, yet he transformed every challenge into an opportunity to elevate his craft, honor his heritage, and pave the way for future Indigenous actors. His story is a reminder that fame often conceals complexity, and that the truth behind the roles we admire can be far more compelling than the characters themselves. Jay Silverheels didn't just play a sidekick. He redefined what it meant to represent a community on screen, leaving a legacy of authenticity, dignity, and perseverance that resonates decades later. The Mask of Tonto may have captured the world's attention, but the man behind it, Jay Silverheels, remains a symbol of courage, identity, and the enduring power of truth.